Alright, so check this out. There's a Python library called Faker that can be used to generate fake data or synthetic data sets. Synthetic data sets can be useful in a bunch of different situations. Let's say, for example, you're working on an application that connects to a database, but you don't currently have any data in the database, so you can generate a fake data set to populate that database with. Another use case is, let's say, you're working on data analysis and data visualization tools, but you don't really have a data set to analyze or visualize. So you can create a fake data set or a synthetic data set using this library. And there's a bunch of other use cases where you might need a synthetic data set. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Faker Python library. So install the library and then you're good to go. All right, let's start coding. So the first thing we need to do is type in from Faker import Faker. This is going to be the class that we're going to be creating an instance of. Next, we create an object called fake, which is going to hold an instance of the Faker class. And further from that point, we should be able to just call any of the Faker methods. So for example, let's say fake.name. If I run this, this gives us a random name. And each time I run this, we're going to get a different name. We can also generate a list of names. So let's say we use list comprehension. So fake.name for x in range, let's say 10. So this is going to generate a list of 10 names for us. We can generate this multiple times and each time we get different names. We can also generate addresses, company names, dates, email addresses, color names, color RGB values, and also random sentences. Granted, these sentences won't really make sense because they're just jumbled up words. All right, next, let's cover providers. So all of these methods that we've called, like name, address, company, date, etc., all of these methods belong to certain providers. And there are various providers for different types of data. Now, Faker ships with a set of standard providers, which is why we have a bunch of these methods available to us out of the box. You can find a list of the standard providers in the Faker documentation, and each provider mentions a list of the methods that it supports. There are also community providers, which are providers made by the community to generate various types of data that the standard providers can't generate, but we won't be covering those in this video. All right, next, let's talk about seeds. So let's say I generate a new list of names. I'll generate this list once, and you can see this is the list of names. If I generate it again, there's a different list. If I generate it again, there's a different list, and again, there's a different list. Now, there might be situations where you might want predictable results. So you don't necessarily want random results. You don't necessarily want random data. You want pseudo-random data. You want to be able to predict what kind of data is going to be generated, or you want to be able to predict the values that are going to be generated. In those situations, you can use seed, and that is going to be taken into account when random data is being generated. So there's two ways that you can go about doing this. One, you can set faker.seed to whatever seed value you want, and this will apply to all Faker instances. So this is basically a global seed value. Another way that you can go about this is you can type fake.seed instance and pass in your seed value in that way. So this seed value is only going to apply to this instance of Faker. All right, so let's try using the seed value. So let's do faker.seed, let's say 5. All right, so pay attention to the names that have been generated here. At least look at the first 4 names and remember them. So now I'm going to change the seed value to 6. Now look at the first 4 names in this seed value. Now if I change this back to 5, you can see the same list of names. And if I change it back to 6 again, you have that same list of names that appeared with 6. So this is how you can create predictable or pseudo-random data. I think a better way to demonstrate this would be having 4 statements instead of just 2. So I'm going to set the value to 5 here, and then that value is 6. And I'm also going to change these statements to print so that it prints in the same line. And now when I run this, you can see the list of names. I can run this multiple times and the names are always going to be the same. Now watch what happens when I comment out these lines. Now we have 2 different lists of names. Each time there's different names being generated. Next, let's talk about locales. So English is not the only language that's supported in Faker. Faker supports multiple locales, so multiple languages, but also multiple countries. Let's try using Faker with multiple locales. So I'm going to create a list here called locales. And for this example, we're going to use 4 locales. We're going to use English US, Arabic Saudi Arabia, English India, and Hindi India. The next thing we need to do is pass in this list of locales while instantiating the Faker class. So we're going to type locale equals locales. Locales in this case is our list of locales that we just made. All right, so now that our Faker instance is using multiple locales, in order to access specific locales methods, we would type fake and then enter the locale like this, and then we can access the methods. So in this case, we do English US. We can also try Arabic Saudi Arabia. So this is going to generate a name in Arabic for us. We can also try Hindi India. This is going to generate a name in Hindi for us. And of course, English India. This is going to generate an Indian name in English. So something to keep in mind is that not all methods are implemented for all locales. When you're using localized providers, it's best to check the Faker documentation to see which providers are supported by that locale. So I'm going to show you an error that you might get if you happen to be trying to access a method that isn't implemented for a specific locale. Let's say we are in EN-US and I try to access Aadhaar ID. Aadhaar ID is not implemented for EN-US. So if I run this, I'm going to get an error saying generator object has no attribute Aadhaar ID. But if I use the Indian locale, so let's say EN-IN, here we are able to access the Aadhaar ID method. So this is one example. Next, let's talk about dynamic providers. All right, so let's say you have your own list of data that you want to randomly select from. This is where dynamic providers can be useful. So we're going to try implementing and adding a dynamic provider to our Faker instance. So first, let's erase this code. Next, we need to import dynamic providers. So we type from faker.providers import dynamic provider. Then we create a new Faker instance. And now we're going to create our dynamic provider. So let's say we want to create a dynamic provider to choose between names of fruits. So let's call this fruit provider. Fruit provider equals dynamic provider. And here we have to give a provider name. This is the name of the method that we're going to be calling to generate this random data. So we're just going to call this fruit. Next, we have to specify the list. So we'll put that in elements. And I'm just going to type out a list of fruit names. All right, so our dynamic provider is ready. Now we need to add this provider to our Faker instance. To do that, we use the add provider method. So fake.add_provider fruit provider. Keep in mind, you have to pass in the name of the variable that we had created, not just fruit. Fruit is going to be the method name. So once we have done this, we should be able to call fake.fruit and generate random data. The data is going to be picked from this list of strings that we have provided. All right, so in terms of creating custom providers, you're not limited to just dynamic providers. You can create much more complex providers as well. So let's try doing that. So first, I'm going to show you a simpler example just so you get an idea of how to implement a custom provider. And then we're going to take a look at a much more complex example to generate a more complex data set. All right, so the first thing we need to do is import base provider. So we type from faker.providers import base provider. Next, we need to define a class that inherits from base provider. So we're going to type class some provider or1 and it inherits from base provider. And then we need to define a method that we're going to be calling on the Faker instance. So let's type def some func or1 pass in self. And just to give a hint, this returns a string. Okay, in this method, let's try to do something a little bit more complex. So let's first create an internal Faker instance. Let's say internal_fake equals Faker. And then we're going to generate a random person's name and a random company name and return that string. So let's say str01 equals internal fake.name, and we mention name here, and then we want the company, so company, and in here we type internal fake.company, and finally we return this string. All right, so this is our custom provider. Now let's add this provider to our Faker instance. The way to do that is we just pass this class into the add provider method. So we do fake.add_provider some provider or1. All right, so before we continue, there's a small change that I need to make. Over here, we're supposed to be calling the method. So I forgot to add the parentheses. So just add that in. And further from that point, we should be able to call some func or1 on our fake instance. So as you can see, it generates the data for us. It says name so-and-so, company so-and-so, and we can generate this over and over again. All right, this is great. Now let's try a much more complex example of a custom provider. So let me set up a scenario here. Let's say you want to create a synthetic data set for an MMORPG's player base. So the records that we want to generate will contain the hero creation date, the player's name, which is going to be the account name, the hero's name, which is going to be the character's name, the class name, and the level. And the assumption here is that each player can have multiple characters. players or multiple heroes. So let's generate this data set. So we're going to be using pandas for this purpose. So the first thing we need to do is import pandas as PD. We're also going to need to import datetime because we're going to be using datetime related functionality. So from datetime, import datetime. All right, great. So we can erase this sum provider O1. We can actually erase a bunch of this code here. We can leave this instantiation line and let's implement our custom provider. So we're going to do class player provider, and this has to inherit from base provider. Then we define a method called player dataset. This takes in self and it returns a pandas data frame. And just for the sake of completing the function, let's add a return statement as well. So return pd.dataframe, and for now it's just empty. We're going to complete that later on once we've finished all of the logic for our player dataset function. All right, so first let's create our internal faker instance. So internal fake equals faker. Then we want to generate a unique list of account names. Keep in mind, each account can have multiple characters. So we create account names list equals internal fake dot name for X in range, let's say 10. So this is going to mean that we have 10 players, and those 10 players can have multiple characters, and there's going to be one record per character. All right, next let's create a dynamic provider for the account names. So we do account names provider equals dynamic provider. The provider name is account name, and the elements are chosen from the account names list. Then we want the hero names. These are the names of the characters that the player can choose from. Now, in my case, I'm setting a list of 5 character names. You don't have to set the same names that I'm setting. You can set whatever names you want. So we do hero names provider equals dynamic provider, provider name, hero name, and the elements, like I said, I'm creating my own list. You can pause the video and enter your own list of 5 names and then continue. All right, so this is my list of hero names. There are 5 hero names here. Next, we want to create a provider for our class names. So class names provider equals, again, dynamic provider, provider name equals class name. Again, even here, you can select your own list of classes, pause the video, enter 5 class names, and then resume. So we have 3 providers now. We need to add all 3 of these providers to our internal faker instance. So we do internal fake.add underscore provider, account names provider, and we do the same thing for hero names provider and class names provider. All right, great. The next thing we need to do is create a list of series. So the idea is we're going to create a list of series. Each series is going to be one row of the data frame. And finally, at the end, we can create the data frame using that list of series. So we create a list, series underscore list equals empty list. And then we start a for loop. So we say for I in range, let's say 50. So in this case, we're going to have 50 rows, series list.append pd.series, and this is where we specify our columns. Not the column names, but the data that's going to be going into those columns. So first we want a date. So we do internal fake dot date between. So we're going to choose a start date and an end date. In my case, I'm going to set it to be between January 1st, 2024 and June 30th, 2024. So this is about 6 months worth of data. Okay, so that's our first column, which is date. The next column is the player name. So we call internal fake dot account name. That is the dynamic provider that we created here. And we do the same thing for hero name and class name. And finally, we want a random integer between 1 and 50 for our level. So we do internal fake dot random underscore int 1 to 50. Okay, finally, we need to specify the column names. So we do that using the index argument. We pass in a list. So we have creation date, account name, hero name, class, and level. All right, so let's go over this real quick. What's going to happen here? We have a series list. This is an empty list so far. And then in this for loop, we add new series objects to this list. So this is going to be a list of series. And then finally, we have to create our data frame out of that list of series and return that data frame as a result. So to do that, we have to call pd.dataframe. And then as the argument, we pass in the series list. All right, that's it. Our custom provider is ready. So the only thing remaining to do is add this provider to our fake instance. So we do fake.add provider, player provider, and then we can call fake.player_dataset. Now, because this is going to be returning about 50 rows, so I'm going to narrow it down. Let's say between 0 and 10. And as you can see, our dataset has been generated. And this is super useful because, as you can see, we defined this custom provider up here in a separate class. And then to generate the entire dataset, we just needed these two lines. And we can use seeds here as well. So let's say I type faker.seed10 and I generate a dataset. Pay attention to the names here. And let's say I try generating this again. Each time the data is the same. And just so I can show you the entire data set in CSV format, let's write this to a CSV file. So let's store this into an object, df01, and then we can do df01.toCSV test01.csv. So we're going to run this and our data is here. All right, so real quick, I just want to add some finishing touches to this. I'm going to sort this data by creation date. And once we sort it, the indices are not going to be in order anymore. So we're going to reset the indices as well. So to do that, we just type dot sort underscore values, and we're going to sort by creation date. And furthermore, we can reset the index. We also set drop to be true. All right, so let's just test this out real quick. I'm going to comment out this line and we're going to type df01.ilock 0 to 10. So this is going to give us the first 10 rows. As you can see, the data has been sorted. All right, so this is how you use the Faker library. This is incredibly useful to create synthetic data sets. So I just wanted to share some information about how to use this library. I hope the video is helpful. I hope you guys have a nice day, and I'll see you all next time.